The side split is mainly an adductor stretch. As we open the legs to the side, or more technically abduct the legs, we stretch the adductor muscles on the inside of the leg. When we gain flexibility and control in this muscle group, we get deeper into the side split. But why, for so many, does progress suddenly stop? The femur bone of the thigh isn't designed to go this far out to the side. The neck of the femur jams up against the rim of the hip socket, also known as acetabulum, preventing the legs from opening further. Bone on bone just doesn't flex very far. It's for this reason that the side split is more complicated than simply stretch more and you'll get there. You need to position your hips and train according to your anatomy. Get this wrong and your side split training is likely to stall completely. But with deliberate modifications in your positioning and some specifically selected exercises, you can overcome this roadblock along with many others. In this video, we're going to break the side split down into its constituent parts, looking at the correct positioning, the triangle versus inline side split, why you should train the adductor muscles at different leverages, why you should strengthen the opposite muscle groups to those being stretched, and more. This is the mechanics of a side split. My personal side split journey started here. This photo was taken as an adult after a decade of martial arts training, with mainstream stretching doing very little for me. I was never gifted with flexibility. It's taken a ton of research and experimentation to develop the refined set of tools I now use with myself and my students. I've gone from the wrong positioning and barely breaking 90 degrees, to triangle side split, inline split, then being able to hold it Van Damme style, and now having the strength to actively pull myself into the side split and use it throughout my physical practice. It is a myth that you can't get flexible as an adult. But first, we must address the proper position for a side split. The way most people attempt the side split causes the hip and femur bone to jam. The point at which this occurs is a phenomenon of the femur's or thigh bone's angle of inclination. This angle of inclination, presented at the head of the femur, differs from person to person. Coxa and Coxa classify the extreme ranges, placing normal range between 120 to 139 degrees of inclination. That's almost 20 degrees of variation in normal hip joints, with more at either end of the spectrum. This drastically affects how high each of us can lift our leg straight out to the side, which translates into the position where your side split jams and feels like it just won't go any further. The neck of the femur bone is making contact with the rim of the hip socket, or acetabulum. In fact, too much collision here can cause microtrauma, which long-term can create a high risk of painful inflammation, so you shouldn't force a position your anatomy won't allow. Now we know that lifting the legs to the side purely through hip abduction, whilst the hips are neutral or tucked under in posterior pelvic tilt, just isn't going to work for the vast majority of people. So how do we modify our side split and start making progress again? We need to change the rotation of the hip joint between our femur bone and our hip socket to allow for enough room to side split. Notice the markers on my hands. We need these points to align to create the optimal position to side split, and there's two ways of achieving this. Imagine this arm is my thigh bone and this is the ball of our ball and socket hip joint, and this hand makes up the rest of my hip. We now know that lifting the leg directly to the side just isn't going to work for the vast majority of people, as the leg butts up against the rim of the hip joint. So how do we fix this? We need to change the orientation of the hip joint to create enough room to side split. First, I can rotate my hip forward to create the position I want and align the tape. Second, I can externally rotate my leg to create the equivalent position and also align the tape. Notice how the markers align in the same way in both cases, because we have created the same position at the hip through two different methods. When the markers are aligned, we are in the optimal position with enough room to be able to achieve our maximum side split. So how do we cue this in an actual side split? The first way of creating this alignment is by anteriorly tilting the front of the hip down to the floor whilst arching our back. In this scenario, the leg is largely fixed and the pelvis does the rotating to create the angle we want and the space in the hip joint to side split. Alternatively, we keep the pelvis position and rotate the legs by pointing the feet up through external rotation instead of keeping them forward. This also creates the angle we want and the same space we need in the hip joint to side split. Both of these cues have achieved the same goal of aligning the points and rotating the hip joint with just enough room to avoid the bone-on-bone collision and allow us to open the leg to the side. Neither position is right or wrong, and I use them both with my students, but the majority of their training is performed with the first option, anterior pelvic tilt. I prefer this variation when standing as it allows for much better stability by keeping the feet flat on the floor. It's much harder to balance when tilted up on the heels by externally rotating the legs. Having said this, when seated on the ground in something like a tailor's pose, you'll naturally be using the external rotation option, so it's worth being aware of both approaches. Most side split drills are performed standing, so I'm going to focus on how you should set up for this position, and into what I call the triangle side split. I call it the triangle side split because when viewed from above, the hips are on a separate line to the feet, forming a triangle. In the triangle position, we aim to get the calves and possibly mid-thigh to the ground. This is a solid side split that is achievable for the vast majority of people. It's unlikely that your structure will stop you miles away from a side split, but it is worth noting that calves to floor may be the anatomical limit for some people, even with this new hip alignment. The triangle side split position will allow our legs to open fully and properly stretch the large adductor muscle group on the inside of the leg without jamming the hip joint. When tilting the hips forwards in the triangle side split, we create some forward lean at the torso. This means we really have to arch our back to keep a high chest. Here we sit the hips back so that the weight is felt in the heels of the feet and counter the weight of the torso going forwards. Really sit back here. One of the most common mistakes is not to sit back far enough. We want a diagonal line forming from our ankles to our hip, whilst keeping our torso upright. Another mistake here is to lean too far forwards. Really keep a high chest, so don't put your hands on the floor if it makes you lean forwards loads. Use an object to prop yourself up properly and keep that position instead. For the vast majority of us, these modifications are needed to get into our deepest side split. Even for those with more ideal side split hips, I've seen better progress made when first working the triangle side split and then training the inline split, where we make full contact with the floor with the feet and hips aligned. Only once the triangle side split position has been comfortably achieved do I recommend incorporating more inline side split focused drills. A common question I get asked is how to position the feet. During my study of traditional Chinese martial arts, there is a large emphasis on keeping the feet forward during side split training. There are different schools of thought on what is most aesthetic or functional, but most people simply don't have the ability to twist enough and uncouple at the ankle to keep the feet forward. So I recommend to simply do what's comfortable. For most people, that'll be turning the feet slightly out. Other common tweaks that you'll have to experiment with include rolling slightly onto the inside of the foot and training with or without shoes. Learning the skill of getting into this position will likely be tricky at first, but for anyone who is serious about getting the side split, it's a fundamental and often breakthrough component, certainly worth persevering with. I always teach my students to exaggerate this position and learn to contract hard, for at least the first phase of training. Expect the correct alignment to feel more intense and harder to hold, especially when first starting, as the musculature and soft tissue is now correctly loaded and not the bone structure, i.e. you're no longer just resting on the joints. Keep maintaining the intention of this position over the course of your side split training, as your body will naturally settle and find your individual optimal alignment over time. So far we've covered the positioning and the cues for the triangle side split, and how it allows you to train in a way that suits our individual anatomy. But what is actually going on with the musculature? Let's dive into which muscles we train and why. We're trying to open the legs. In a side split, all of the adductors are being stretched from the larger adductor magnus and longus to the smaller pectineus. But the most notable adductor in side split training is gracilis. Unlike the other adductors, gracilis crosses the knee joint, inserting on the tibia bone of the lower leg. Since the knee is locked during side splits, the gracilis is often placed under a relatively greater stretch, making it a common limiting factor. By changing the angle of the knee, we can change the relative stretch on the gracilis. Leg locked equals more focus on the gracilis, whilst the bend in the knee equals more focus on the other adductor muscles. This is why loaded stretching drills such as horse stance squats and tailor's pose are so effective. If we compare side by side between a straight leg get up, horse stance squat and tailor's pose, notice how the angle of the knee varies from fully straight to 90 degrees to fully bent. Each of these positions changes the stimulus on the adductor muscles. Now, a side split is a heavy flexibility skill. What I mean by this is that by having the legs so far out to the side, the adductors are put in a mechanically disadvantageous position and have to support our entire body weight. Not building the strength in the adductors to support this position is a fast way to stop the body cooperating. It's for this reason more active base side split training is so powerful, as we need to train the adductors to be strong at the end range of motion so that the body feels safe to allow them to relax and open. This is even more important if you want to be able to side split with little to no warm-up, Van Damme split, and to be able to use your side split in your sport. Now there's more than just stretching the adductors. In order to pull the legs apart, our hip abductors, which are the opposite or antagonists to the adductors, the deep hip rotators and hip flexors, need to actively contract and have the strength to pull us into the correct position. The muscles of hip abduction, so lifting the leg away from the body, namely the glute minimus, medius, and tensor fascia lata, or TFL, counteract the pull of the adductors. They need to have the strength to overcome the pull from the adductors, which are powerful and commonly tight muscles. If your glutes are trying to pull the legs apart but are not strong enough, then the adductors won't release and your side split will stall. When working towards advanced side split variations such as tilt, this becomes even more important as these muscles have to lift and hold the leg off the floor against gravity rather than pulling with gravity. In a normal side split, this action is to pull you down and push the hip forwards. For some, more isolated training for the glutes and TFL to strengthen their ability to lift and open the legs is required. Additionally, we need a decent degree of hip flexor strength at end range to pull us into that proper anterior pelvic tilt position. If this can't be achieved, then the hip flexors will likely require direct work. For anyone who has weak hip flexors, tying in pancake flexibility training at the end of your side split session can be highly effective to build the strength needed to get into the proper position. When externally rotating the leg, you recruit the likes of the deep hip rotators, glutes, psoas, and sartorius. These muscles need the strength and range to turn out the femur and create that proper position. As a group, the quads play a relatively easy role in a side split, keeping the legs extended and assisting in hip flexion. Having said this, the vastus medialis, or VMO, takes on the brunt of the work of the quads in this position. The VMO plays a core role in the proper tracking of the patella or kneecap and preventing the knee from collapsing inwards, i.e. closely aligned to the direction gravity is pulling the knee in a side split. Pain on the inside of the leg around the knee during side split training can often be attributed to a weak VMO. Now remember that the gracilis muscle also crosses the knee joint and is heavily involved during side split training. It is also possible that discomfort along the inside of the knee is down to heavy involvement of this muscle. In summary, you need to learn and practice the proper side split alignment, and if you take one thing away, try the triangle side split position. Understanding this has often produced breakthrough moments and personal bests in my students. Next, assess the strength and flexibility of your adductors at different leverages. Identify whether you need to isolate the hip abductors, hip flexors, or rotators that are responsible for pulling you into the proper position, and build your training program to properly target your individual weak links whilst teaching your body how to coordinate which muscles to contract and which to relax for the side split. Understand these and you'll be a huge step ahead in your side split training. You can see there is no one perfect program for everyone, meaning it is absolutely essential to learn how to individualize your flexibility training specifically to you if you want to make real progress. We understand that learning how to individualize your training can seem daunting at first, which is why we built the Mobility and Flexibility Toolkit. It's not a one-size-fits-all program, but a toolkit that will teach you why you train the way you do and show you exactly how to put it into practice. The side split is just one part of this huge resource, showing the best tools we have discovered for increasing your range of motion as an adult, including assessments, technique breakdowns, how to write your own program, and much more. We're a dedicated global community who are serious about our flexibility training. As part of the Mobility and Flexibility Toolkit, we've created an exclusive free training covering some of the most misunderstood concepts limiting people's flexibility progress. In the free training, you'll learn the real difference between passive and active flexibility, how to properly track if you're improving session to session, how your orientation to gravity influences the training response, and much more. Get these right and you'll never look back. You won't be training your range of motion the same again. To join the free training, the link is in the description. For any questions on the mechanics of the side split, let me know and I'll do my best to answer them in the comments below.